Hello everybody, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here for this first Lead with Tempo event. My name is Harry Ashbridge and I am the Head of Writing and Customer Experience at Monzo, which is an overly grand way of basically saying that it's my responsibility to make sure that the quality of the writing that we do stays really high and that customer centricity is more than just a couple of awkward words on a slide somewhere. I have been at Monzo for just over 4 years. I was the first writer. I set up the writing team and wrote our tone of voice. Before that, I spent about 6 years at language consultancy, The Writer. We used to go around saying that we were the world's largest language consultancy. They probably are still saying that now, to be honest, because ultimately nobody could prove that it wasn't true. I'm here today to do a riff on a talk that I've given a couple of times before, which is about creating a culture of care for language. Not so much about the kind of processes and procedures around writing, although I will talk about that a little bit. It's more about how to create the kind of environment that means it's easier to get support for those processes and procedures, support for investment in the kind of things that help you to be able to do good writing at scale. And specifically this time, it's around how to make sure that you can get leaders brought in to that culture of care for language, because ultimately they are the ones who hold all the budget and make all of the decisions. Now, most of us probably didn't get into writing because of a deep and abiding love of stakeholder management. But unfortunately, the more senior that you get, the more that the job starts to become about making friends and influencing people, ultimately. And a few caveats here to make. The first is one that I always say whenever I'm talking about this, so if I'm ever talking about stakeholder management or influencing people or changing things in a business, which is that the day-to-day process of doing that is about speaking up in meetings, about making your opinion heard, about disagreeing with decisions, and all of that is definitely made easier if you are, like me, a straight white man, because there aren't many spaces that I have to go into where I wonder if I'm going to be judged for anything other than the content of the opinion that I'm giving. I don't think that any of the things that I'm advocating for here only work if you have the same package of privileges that I do. But when it comes to being heard and feeling like I've got permission to speak up, obviously there are a million big and small things at work that are made easier when you have the privileges that I do. It's also worth me saying that I'm not part of a content design team. The remit that we have at Monzo for the writing team, and it's deliberately titled the writing team to stay neutral, is all of the writing at Monzo. Again, I don't think anything about what I'm saying doesn't work if you have a team that is more closely aligned with design or only works on customer-facing stuff. But I do think that we've had, certainly a big part of whatever success we've had is down to the fact that we are able to and have permission to get involved with all of the writing that Monzo does internally and externally, because that helps tie together the value for people of what writing can do for you. The last thing that I will point out before I actually get on with talking about the things I want to talk about is that when it comes to talking about culture and influencing culture, what you can do, what's possible, and how easy it might be is obviously dependent on the existing culture where you are now. And I always say that I was really fortunate to join Monzo when I did. I was pushing against an open door. There were definitely people there that understood the value of good writing, and it was something that they already cared about, because when you set out with a mission to upend the financial industry and demystify money and make money work for everybody, one of the things that you have to do if you think that banking is harder than it needs to be is look at communication. That was already in progress, and all I did was kind of codify and put structure around what was already there. So the culture was definitely leaning in my direction. Now, none of that stuff, if you do or don't have the advantages I've had at Monzo, I think means it's impossible to do what I'm suggesting for the next sort of 15 minutes or so, because I think that what I'm going to talk about here are building blocks that make it easier to get that support for a culture of care for writing with leaders in a business, kind of no matter what the starting position is where you are. And those things are to help prove that writing is a problem solver for the business, and to help those leaders actually become ambassadors for language themselves, to be role models of the good behaviour that you want to see. To start with, proving that writing is a problem solver. Rightly or very much wrongly, writing is still seen as the kind of poor second cousin of design, proper design. It's nice when it's nice, it probably makes customers happier in some way, but when the budget push comes to shove, it is not often the thing that gets prioritized. And I think part of that misunderstanding comes from how we as writers think about working with other teams. I have seen writers make the case broadly for writing on its own terms, to defend writing on its own terms, insisting on being involved in processes, talking about the kind of ephemeral value of consistency, fretting about things going out which aren't in our tone of voice, talking about brand value. And to be clear, I've seen that because I have been that writer many times myself. But the penny dropped for me really when I realised that the right way to approach things was to convince people about the value of writing from the opposite angle. Some people just get the intrinsic value of good writing, and they're easy to get on side because they understand it. But most people don't, and even the ones that do are most likely going to underestimate the impact that changing the way that we write or think about writing can have on business goals in general. But why should they know that stuff? It's kind of, I think, our job to educate them on that stuff. Better writing is a way to help solve, if not entirely solve, any problem that a business has. And if you can get leaders to see writing as a contributor to business goals, then you change that conversation. You get them thinking differently about writing in general. So when I joined Monzo as the first writer in a place which didn't have any tone of voice guidelines, rather than go around talking about the importance of tone of voice or brand consistency, or even really about the difference that writing could make in the end user experience, I went around each kind of member of the leadership team and just asked them, what problems do you have? Because it wasn't about proving off the bat the difference that good writing could make in the customer experience to our brand. It was about getting the people I was talking to think differently about writing and the value that it might have. With our leadership team, that kind of ran the whole gamut of business issues. In operations, it was about customer service handling times. In product, the leadership there were worried about feature adoption. In the people team, it was all about the time it was taking to hire because we were growing so fast. And writing could help solve all those problems. So most of our customer service is handled through in-app chat. And to make people be able to move quickly enough, we had a bank of pre-written saved responses that we used to solve customer queries. I looked at those, and obviously there was work that we could do to improve them and make them easier to pass from the customer service end so they could find what they needed from the actual names of the responses before they went to customers. And then for those customers, easier to understand, putting the main point first, making sure they were nice and clear and not using any technicality. And that was one of the first things I did at Monzo. So writing could make a measurable difference to customer service handling times straight off the bat, basically as soon as I joined. In product land, the issue was that teams were often looking to hero their own products, their own features that they were shipping, and understandably so. They were proud of them. They'd made a lot of inroads into innovation, and they were doing stuff that they should be proud of. But teams weren't really thinking holistically about how those features would fit together when you spoke about them, let alone how they would literally sit together in the app. But what were they called? What did that mean for the language we used to describe them? How did those things interact? And so there was naming architecture and information architecture work to do, as well as looking at the actual journeys in the app. And then the people team, the obvious place to start, I thought, was with job ads. So templates, training for hiring managers, support for kind of automated responses that the hiring team could use, so that the quality and consistency of candidates we were getting in the door was a better match for our values and culture straight away, because they were seeing our culture and value reflected in the ads that we were actually putting out into the world, and people could self-select for whether they wanted that, whether they wanted to work in that environment, whether it felt like it fit for them. Now, good writing obviously is not kind of the magic bullet for all of these things. And we don't think that writers riding in like the cavalry is necessarily the right way to work with other teams. It's not the nirvana that we all dream of. But writing does have an outsized impact, especially stacked up against the time and expense of things like engineering, which of course is going to be music to any leadership team's ears when they spend their days making cost-benefit decisions and trying to weigh things up against each other, stack ranking priorities. A team that can have a relatively quick, cheap, measurable impact on goals is very welcome. And after those early interventions, that kind of seed was planted. Good writing matters. It has an impact. We should take it seriously as a leadership team. Getting senior sign-off on our tone of voice guidelines after that was relatively straightforward. And no one batted an eyelid when I said that I wanted to run writing training for all new and existing Monzonauts either, because it wasn't about some fluffy idea of brand. It was about giving everybody skills to be better at solving business problems, because writing is a core skill that everybody at work uses every day. That then spreads into individual teams themselves, seeing the value of good writing through that training that they get when they join, and writing naturally over time becomes more embedded into processes and ways of working, because it's just part of how we do things at Monzo. That is where you get that kind of genesis of a culture of care for language starting from the top down, because that support is there from the early days. And the next idea was about helping people to be language ambassadors. A thing I like to go on about in training a lot is that the writing a company does is kind of evidence of its values in action. If the ads and the emails that they put out are nice and well defined, and they have well crafted, and they have a clear voice and identity, but then the T's and C's are entirely incomprehensible, or the collections messaging is blunt and aggressive, they are showing you something about what they think of their relationship to customers and what really matters to them. And people see through that. You know, there is a reason that lots of companies have multi-million dollars in advertising and marketing and brand campaigns, but they have net promoter scores in the toilet. Consistency matters. And it matters internally too, because if one part of the business is preaching the importance of clear, empathetic, consistent communication to customers, and then there are teams inside the company who do the opposite, that clash is going to make it harder for the culture of care for language to take hold. That consistency especially matters when it comes to people in the leadership team, because culture, especially in startups, is heavily influenced by the people at the top of the business, what they're seen to be doing, and whether they intend it or not, how they act and communicate is implicitly setting the tone for what is acceptable. So you're not going to get very far on a campaign to change how a company thinks about the value of writing with an executive committee who throw acronyms, technical language, and business speak around all the time and sound very cold and clipped and clinical. Hopefully you work with a bunch of leaders who are already great communicators, in which case, fantastic, and you can skip this next bit and maybe go and get a coffee. But otherwise, I think there are a couple of things that you can do to help people engage better with the communication that they do and see that their own communication with the business is part of creating that culture of care for language. First thing to remember is leaders are people too. And however well-intentioned and however senior they are and however uncomfortable it might be for you, giving people feedback on writing can often feel like, to them, a personal attack. Words are our primary source of interaction with the world. We are full of prejudices and preconceptions, misconceptions about what the proper way to write is, especially in a business professional context. And the spectre of that red pen wielding teacher that we had in year 4 is often really front of mind with people when they're writing or when their writing is being judged. And if you couple that with the fact that for many senior people in a business, there is a lot of stress attached to how they present themselves in their companies, the personal brand that they're building or trying to project, helping leaders to get better at writing is a delicate topic to approach. There's not really a fixed template for helping somebody improve their writing. You're dealing with an individual. You have to tailor your methods to that individual. But one thing I would definitely suggest is to tie any help to the goals that they are trying to achieve. What are they working on? Are they trying to change the company narrative? Are they distilling big problems into manageable goals? Are they building up their own personal brand, getting more of their personality into their communications? Again, this is about making sure that the advice to them to help improve their writing isn't about what your goals are as trying to create this culture of care for language. It's about tying the impact that better writing can have to what they are trying to achieve. And that is the advice. So when it comes to getting leaders bought into the value of language, you have to make sure that they can see that writing is a problem solver, not just a nice to have. And then you can make sure that they themselves are following through with it by communicating clearly themselves and being the role models for good writing that you want the rest of the company to aspire to. That doesn't magically solve all our problems as people in writing disciplines, but it definitely does, and it has in any way, in our case at Monzo, made it easier to get buy-in and support around the rest of the business for caring about the things that make it easier to create good writing at scale. And how do you know if that kind of thing is working? Just before Christmas, A couple of new internal people policies have made it to the board for review at Monzo, but the board actually sent them back down to my team for review. They were worried that Monzonauts would struggle with the technicality. They didn't want us putting anything out there that would meet our bar for empathetic, clear communication, which, to be honest, was kind of a pain because we hadn't allowed any space in our schedule to be reviewing a couple of quite chunky, big technical people policies on top of all of our other work. But it was also an absolute joy because that is the culture of careful language from the top down. An understanding of the value of good writing, a commitment to upholding high standards, and ultimately role modelling the kind of behaviour that we want from everybody at Monzo. Because if we're willing to slow things down at the board level to get even internal documentation right, what does that say culturally about the level of rigour and the attention to detail we're going to give to customer-facing communication? It sends a great signal to everyone in the business that words are not an afterthought. And that is all I've got to say today, folks. Hopefully you found it interesting and useful, and I would love to hear from people what things you've done that have or haven't worked when it comes to getting people to buy in and care about language at the leadership level and down. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.